Thank you for coming today. I'm wondering how many people here actually knew Herbert Hosmer. How many went to a puppet show when they were younger? Nice. So you know most of what I'm going to tell you already, but I'm going to fill in hopefully some more interesting details. There you go. Yes, somebody had better. Somebody had better. Thank you. This is a PowerPoint show I put together, and it's heavy on Herb, but it also touches on his family, because you can't really tell the Herbert Hosmer story without the context of his family. Herbert was born April 9, 1913. April 9, 1913. In those days, most people were not born in a hospital. Herbert wasn't either. He was born at home, back home in his mother and father's bed in Sterling-Lancaster, in a little old house that the family had owned for several generations. His earliest immediate family member in the Chandler family was the uncle Captain Samuel Ward, who was a great-great-great-great-grand-uncle, I believe, or maybe I got one extra grade in there. He had been born in Worcester. He was from a very prominent family in the area, with the Wards, and he married his uncle's wife's niece. So the uncle and he married, I'm getting that wrong, I skipped a generation, forgive me. He married Dolly Green Chandler, and they had a nephew and a niece between them that ended up marrying one another. So they adopted his sister's niece, who was down in Connecticut, and he went down and brought her back when she was around 9. The family was large, and it was very common then. You didn't have welfare or Social Security or many of the safety nets we've come to take for granted perhaps today. And the uncle wanted a child. They had a couple of children that died young. They had one son that we presume may have had Down syndrome. He had some ailment, and the family, of course, back then was a little more quiet about that. But piecing things together, it's assumed he may have had Down syndrome. He only lived up into his 20s. And they wanted an heir and a child to raise into adulthood. So the little niece, Dolly Green Chandler, was scooped up, Dolly Green Ward down in Connecticut, was brought home and raised by them. And she ended up marrying, as I mentioned, Dolly's nephew, Nathaniel Chandler. So there was an interesting connection there between this couple that have their niece and their nephew. The niece they raised married the nephew. And those family, of course, had been out in Petersham. Nathaniel Chandler had been out in Petersham at what's called the Deer Farm. It's still out there. And when the captain died, he left provisions for his wife Dolly to be cared for. And when she died, the farm went to the niece and nephew that had married one another and the niece that they had raised. So the family moved from Petersham out here in the early 1800s, about 1825, I believe it was, and they settled in the Captain Samuel Ward house. This house was a very old house. A section of it included the second parsonage from 1666. We think recycling's a new idea. It's not. They recycled a lot back then. I don't know how they juggled buildings around like they did, but they seemed to have no problem moving half a building or a shed or around and joining it to another one and recycling it. Interesting thing, it usually was done in the winter when the ground was frozen, and they could pull it on large like sleds and oxen. Yes, sir?
They also had them, instead of sleds, they would run rollers.
Roller boards, or logs.
And with oxen,
yeah.
like you said,
yeah.
to move a house. I saw a person do that once.
Yeah.
You know, when I was over at Village Power in Berlin,
yeah.
they moved the original post office down to where Indian Head Farm.
Oh, okay, heading towards Hudson.
And they built the new post office.
Nice.
Up there, and I saw them run the pole.
It's still done, but not as common. Back then, though, it was less money to recycle and move than to rebuild or to get new material. Today, it's unfortunately gone the opposite, and a lot of stuff gets torn down that shouldn't. So anyways, the Captain Samuel Ward house was in Sterling-Lancaster. Here's an 1870 map, a Beers map, and I'm going to see here if I can find, all right. See Nathaniel Thayer's residence up there on the top right? and the cemetery, the middle cemetery that's colored in green. If you follow that over a couple of buildings over to the corner here, what's George Hill Road now, and East George Hill Road, this is where the men's dormitory for Atlantic Union College got built in 1956-57. That building there, it says Mrs. M.G. Ware, was the Captain Samuel Ward house. Mary Green Chandler Ware was the daughter, one of the daughters of Nathaniel and Dolly Green Chandler, and that became her house. We have here another map from 1879, the history of Lancaster by Abijah Marvin. And again, we see, we got to find the right spot, get oriented here, but the building is on shown on this as well. I believe it's, let's see, am I getting this right? Map of Lancaster, South Branch, Old Common. This is South Lancaster, I think. Here, that's the river there. It's the river there. I believe it's number, oh my, where am I? Might be number 11. I'm trying to get my orientation onto the map. A little tricky looking at sideways, sorry. But it's shown again there. And here's a picture of the old house. So there were really two sections, the front and then the back, and they believed one of these, I guess, had been part of the 1666 parsonage, and it was moved and joined to the other building. Captain Ward, he was a soldier in the French and Indian Wars. He fought with Washington. You know, he wasn't tight buddies, but he fought under with Washington during that war. Later, in his older age, he had become a very prominent citizen of South Lancaster. He had one of the largest mercantile shops in the county, very successful general store, basically, across the street. And I think he had begun it with Willard, one of the Willards. And he had as a teacher, as a young boy in Worcester, John Adams for a while, because he was teaching in Worcester. So interesting connections. And during the early throes of the Revolution, you might think he'd be a little more leaning of the Tory side because he had a lot of money and a lot to risk. But he cast his lot with the Patriots. He was too old to fight, but he was on some very key committees, letters of correspondence committees, and others between here and Worcester and Boston, serving the Lancaster community and helping to forge the early steps into what became the American Revolution. So he was a supporter of the Revolutionary War. Here's another view of the house here. Now, if you look at this one, you can see the carriage sheds that were all attached here. This carriage shed to the left, the very end, is where his great-great-grandnephew, Herbert Hosmer, set up the toy cupboard bookshop and toy store first in 1940, and then a year later converted it into the toy cupboard theater, or the puppet theater. So that was where the original toy cupboard theater had been. And this picture is probably from around 1900. Beautiful building. It's so sad that it got torn down when they made way for the dorm. When they did tear it down, though, in 1956-57, Herbert and his mother, the father died in 1955, they moved across the street. They stayed a short while in what's now the Brown House. It's on the corner still. It used to be part of the Thayer Mansion nearby. And he resided there a short while with his mother while they built the new house on East George Hill Road, which is the place most all of us remember. And that would have been built around 1957. And he recycled some of the lumber, some of the door frames, the windows. They detached and moved the shed, and also staircases. And some of the original 1666 paneling was removed from the house before it was raised, and it was incorporated upstairs in Hosmer's house. And a very interesting thing, the new people who came along, the Hardigans, who bought the place after Herbert died in around 2000, late 1990s, they had been doing some remodeling, and they'd removed the paneling, they'd stuck it downstairs in storage to the side, and they had a fire. And that room got heavily damaged. So praise the Lord that the panels happened to be displaced because they were remodeling, and they were saved, and they were returned after the damage was repaired, and they're still in the house. So some of the oldest paneling we have in town from our early colonial period still in the new house down there.
John?
Yes.
I have a question. Okay, in I would correspond with Herbert,
Mhm.
and the house would be referred to as a ministerial. So is it
Yeah.
because of that part of the older house?
Right. The land upon which Herbert built the new house, just across the street and down a little to the left, was part of the original ministerial land. Herbert believed in ghosts. Being a good Seventh-day Adventist, I don't espouse the same theory, but it's an interesting time of year to tell ghost stories. He used to talk about noises in the night, the bell ringing mysteriously, furniture moving and dropping on the floor, books and odd things, sundry and odd, inexplainable things occurring there. He believed it was the ghost of the first, not the first minister, because we know the first minister was Rowlandson, and they moved after the massacre to Connecticut. But the second minister, we had a tough flock here in Lancaster. The first minister nearly got killed by the Indians. The second minister got killed by a parishioner who thought he was an Indian. Yes, and then the third one had a problem too, so it was a pretty rough place to come to. Oh, he was scalped by the Indians. He was killed and scalped, that's right. Yes. Then the third one was killed. Yes, it was one of the Prescotts that took him for an Indian as a sentry at night. He shot the minister and realized, oops, it's not an Indian, it's the pastor. So he thought it was one of the ghosts of the ministers.
The ministerial land was the land where the home of the second and third ministers were.
Right.
So the haunting comes from the present site.
The first ministerial lands were Thayer Conservatory, is in that region, I believe, in there, because that was where the Rawlinson garrison used to be. Yep. So the second one was up towards where Herb is. So that's why he called it, and there's still a stone out in the stone wall with the plaque, ministerial lands. But the second ministerial home, 1666, some of the wood came, and they believe those panels that I just mentioned came out of that building. And that was some of the wood that was salvaged by Herbert and his mother when they built the new house in 1957. Yeah. And there's another question here? I thought it's another hand. Yes, sir.
Just to be clear,
Yes.
that house right there wasn't haunted, it's the present site.
Yeah, well, no, I've read where they said there were strange happenings here too.
Okay.
So both places had these stories related to it. But anyways, this house, the story we just read by Paul LaCour, who I was friends with, Paul was fantastic. As a young boy, he came down to the Toy Cupboard Theater, and he was so enthralled by what he saw and taken by Herbert's presentation. He went home that very night and drew a little map so we'd know how to get back to it again. And he saved that little map. They had it, Herbert had it. It was quite comical. They had it for years. And when he got older, he learned to do puppetry himself. Herbert didn't train him, but he used to come here a lot to watch the Toy Cupboard Theater shows. And he learned puppetry on his own. And he worked at Whalen Park, another bygone monumental place, and he ran the puppets there for years. And then on a whim, when he was in late high school or college age, some of his buddies were out for a ride, tooling around, having a ball, and he says, let's stop over here and see if that place is still going where I used to go when I was a kid. And he knocked on the door, and lo and behold, Herbert came to the door. And so he told Herbert who he was, and then Herbert remembered him, of course. And they became thick, fast friends yet again. And that was a time when Herbert was a little on the downside because he had gotten some cancer and he was taking a hiatus from teaching, and he'd had a couple of seasons where he wasn't up to doing the puppet shows. So he asked Paul, would you come and help me start the theater up again? And Paul did. And Paul had a very, very close relationship with him, helping him right to the end in 1995. So we have much to be grateful to Paul for saving some of the history and the puppets and stuff. Otherwise, we may not have had so many things preserved. We've lost a lot, but at least we have some of the core crumbs, as I like to say. Paul was instrumental in that, very instrumental. And anyways, so this is the Captain Samuel Ward house. Now, as I mentioned, his niece married his wife's nephew, Nathaniel Chandler, and here's a nice picture of Nathaniel Chandler. He was born 1773, died 1852. When he died, he did an unusual thing. He left everything to his wife, nothing to his children. Usually they divvied up with the children, but he left everything to her. He was in the insane asylum in Worcester. He'd had a mental breakdown at some point, and one of his cousins, Dr. Chandler, was taking care of him. But he had enough presence of mind to know that he wanted his wife taken care of, and she was. She was amply taken care of until her death in 1869. And this is Dolly Green Chandler. And again, she was the niece of Dolly Green Chandler was the wife of, Dolly Green was the wife of Captain Samuel Ward. So here she is in her older age. They lived in the Captain Samuel Ward house after they moved here from Petersham around 1825. They had a daughter, they had several children, but one of the daughters was Catherine Amory Chandler Parsons, born in 1805 in Petersham, and she died in 1886 in Boston. She married well. She married Theophilus Parsons, Jr., who was the son of Theophilus Parsons, the Supreme Justice of the Massachusetts, Chief Justice, rather, of the Massachusetts Supreme Court, and a very prominent judge and attorney in Boston. He went on, her husband, whose picture we have here, Theophilus Parsons, Jr., he went on to become a very popular and learned professor at Harvard in the law department. He was a lawyer like his father, and he wrote a lot of books. He and his father were very well known in the Boston circuit. They became early subscribers to a new denomination, a new church that was rising up among some of the more intellectual. He was heavily involved with the Transcendentalists, and of course was friends with all the gamut over in Concord, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and my mind is blanking. Yes, Thoreau and Alcott's and all of them. But he taught at Harvard, and he was involved in the Swedenborgian Church, the New Jerusalem Church. And as a result, some of the other family spilled into that particular belief too, the least of which wasn't his sister-in-law, Catherine's younger sister, Mary Green Chandler, who lived here in South Lancaster and married another famous Bostonian of the day, a prominent physician and surgeon who worked with Harvard, also Dr. Ware. So they're very well-connected, very intelligent, cutting-edge people here who were related to Herbert. And Mary was instrumental in helping to start the Swedenborgian Church here in Lancaster later. They met in her house for years, the Captain Samuel Ward house, and then they built a place right nearby here on Neck Road that was the Wilder Memorial. And it was that up until the 1920s when the Current Topics Club purchased it and made it their clubhouse. And it ran up until, sadly, some of the leaders tossed it aside, sold it, bullied the other members into selling it back in the early 2000s. And thank you. And now it's a private residence, but it's still nearby here. Anyways, this was Theophilus Parsons. Now, they lived on Beacon Hill. They had a very prominent home up in the thick of the Boston Brahmin section. And they were neighbors to one of the most famous architects of the day, Native American by the name of Charles Bulfinch, who pioneered the Federalist architecture. He designed the Bulfinch Church we have here on the green. It was built in 1816, the year without a winter. It snowed every month that year, even 4th of July we got snow.
The year without a summer.
I'm sorry, the year without a summer. I said that backwards. Thank you. Thank you. Getting it backwards. I got Lexdicia. So the Capitol Dome in Washington, D.C. was designed by him, and the State House, the old State House up on Beacon Hill, also designed by Charles Bulfinch. So they were neighbors and friends. And around the 1840s, the Chandler Parson house, or really Parsons, up on Beacon Hill, had a nice surprise one Christmas morning for the daughters, a nice new dollhouse that was custom made. It replicated their own home. It looked just like their home on Beacon Hill. And the daughters, the Parsons children, enjoyed it. They were thoroughly thrilled to have this special made dollhouse of their own home. There's some thought that Bulfinch may have had a hand in making it. We don't know. Herbert used to speculate. Herbert had a very vivid and wild imagination. And, you know, like people say, tell me about this or that. And I said, do you know about this or that? I said, sure. And if I don't know something up, I could always make a good thing up for you. So,
Never let the truth get in the way
of a good story, right?
Yeah,
So this particular dollhouse was passed along to the cousins, the country cousins in Lancaster after the Parsons children had outgrown it. So sometime by the 1860s, 70s, it found its way to South Lancaster and into the home of George Frederick Chandler's daughters. And George Frederick Chandler was another brother to Mary Green Chandler Ware and Catherine Chandler Parsons. And their little girls, the three little girls, Caroline, Miriam, and Elizabeth, who was known as Bessie, loved that dollhouse and they played with it to their heart's content. Well, they outgrew it eventually, and of the three girls, only one had married, and that was Caroline. She married Robert Avery of Clinton, and she had a daughter and a son, Robert, and also, she married George, but she had a son, Robert. And she had a daughter, Elizabeth, who was known as Beth Avery. And Beth played with the dollhouse to her heart's content. And she married a fellow named Herbert Hosmer Sr. He was Herbert Hosmer, Herbert Henry Hosmer. And they made their home in South Lancaster, first in Clinton, then South Lancaster. They ended up having a little boy named Herbert Henry Hosmer Jr. in 1913. And wouldn't you know, he decided he liked dollhouses too. So that little dollhouse, or that big dollhouse, was passed along to him in the late teens, early 20s. He fell in love with that thing. And he made that the centerpiece of his dollhouse collection for the rest of his life. And he collected very profusely. He had tiny toy dollhouses, bliss dollhouses, custom-made ones, all sorts and shapes and sizes of dollhouses, any kind he could get his hands upon. The first one having been one he helped buy in Worcester. It was the store model of a tiny toy dollhouse. And he had a paper route, as he told me, to get enough money just to buy that dollhouse during the Depression days. So he got the dollhouse there. And this one in particular, he wanted to restore the Parson Chandler one to mimic the actual house for which it represented on Beacon Hill. Well, now, he had portraits and photographs of the family members that had been there. He had some of the furniture that had been passed along into Lancaster and still in possession of the family. He had portraits, painted portraits. He had photographs showing the interior. He knew that house pretty well, and he wanted to make that dollhouse look just like the real house had, close as possible. So guess how much money he spent in his lifetime on this special dollhouse to restore it the way he wanted, to represent the family home on Beacon Hill. Take a wild guess how much money he spent on a dollhouse. $100,000. He spent over $100,000. He could have bought a real house back then, two of them probably, for that kind of money. Now, he didn't spend it all in one stop. You know, this was over decades. But the cumulative cost of his spending on this house was over $100,000. He himself told me one day when we were looking at it down his living room, one of my many visits. I wish I'd visited more now. He had been at a quandary to find the right miniature tea kettle to represent the family tea kettle. None of the ones he could find through any of the dealers and producers matched it. It was all different styles. He wanted it to be authentic to every little detail possible. And lo and behold, not only did he have a picture of the room with the tea kettle on, he had the original tea kettle that got passed along to Lancaster, and they had it. He had this beautiful silver tea kettle from the early 1800s, and he flipped it over one day and noticed on the bottom there were the manufacturer's marks. He did some research. He was a great researcher. He'd go to Boston Public Library, to the American Antiquarian Society. He would correspond places. He was an avid researcher. He determined that company was not only such and such a company, whatever the name was, but it was still in business like 175 years later. And so he wrote to them and sent them pictures of the tea kettle. And before it was over, $2,000 or $3,000 later, they manufactured a special little miniature to scale for his Parson Chandler dollhouse. And we have it. You get to see it in the other room later. And they sent it all the way from London, England, where the company was. and that's how he furnished the dollhouse. So you get an idea how he could spend $100,000 on one dollhouse over the years. But the end product was a very exquisite historical representation of his prominent relative's home on Beacon Hill. And he even had a little custom-made doll. All the dolls were custom-made to represent the faces and the people, the relatives. He had one of the neighbor made too, Charles Bullfinch. That's in the dollhouse also. So it's very interesting, all these connections Herbert had. Here's Mary Green Chandler Ware, the sister I mentioned. She's the one that inherited the house when the mother died in 69. So she ended up staying in the old Captain Samuel Ward house. Now, they were neighbors to her brother, George Frederick Chandler, who happened to have the first commercial greenhouse in Worcester County. And he bought a little house on Main Street, just a little further south of the big Captain Samuel Ward house. And the little house he purchased was the house built in 1841 by the minister of the Unitarian Church named Edmund Hamilton Sears. He came at the end of 1840. He preached his first sermon for Christmas of 1840, and he soon built the little house and moved to town. He was most famous for having written the Christmas carol, "It Came Upon a Midnight Clear," although he called it "That Glorious Song of Old." And so he lived there for several years. People loved him. He was very poetic, wrote a lot of nice poems. "Sunrise at George Hill" was a favorite local poem. We have a handwritten copy in the collection, thankfully, that he had written himself. But he had a breakdown. He had a nervous breakdown. He was so emotional. He took on all the burdens and emotions of his parishioners and internalized it, and it wasn't good for his health. So around 1845 he left. By 1847 he resigned. He went back to Sudbury, Wayland, where he'd come from, and he poured himself into editorial work in the Unitarian periodical. And he did preach again over to Sudbury and on occasion back to Lancaster, and he kept in touch with his Lancaster friends. Well, George Frederick Chandler bought his house in 1847, and he put the greenhouses in the back soon after. Well, that's the house that Herbert was born in 1913. So the family was really close together in town, neighbors, and this is the woman that got the larger house, the Captain Samuel Ward house. Here's her husband, the famous Dr. John Ware. He had a daughter from his earlier marriage, and she had come out here too, and they were all very intensely involved in Swedenborgian church and movement in the state of Massachusetts and the area. Well, her daughter married a young upstart that had come into town, William McNeil. He had been the library director for a year. He was a trustee. He got a job in the Lancaster Bank, which became the Lancaster National Bank, and he was doing very well for himself. He'd come from England, and he seemed to be a bright and shining star. He encouraged his wife to put her money in the bank, of course. And they had all this money in there, a lot of influence. Well, in the 1880s, would you believe it, he and a shady partner of his he had come to somehow know, over from around Lowell, they robbed the bank. They robbed the Lancaster Bank, took all the money and absconded during the night. By the time they was figured out, they were hot on the trail with the authorities to try to get them. He slipped up across the border into Canada, and he never was able to return to the United States again. And they secreted most of the loot in a cave up by Rutland, Vermont, when they were making their escape up along the back way to get to Canada. And he must have taken a little bit with him, because he soon had a nice, handsome farm up there with a big herd of cow. But the United States couldn't touch him. We didn't have the legal authority back then to reach across the border. Well, his wife and the children soon went up to join him. But the scoundrel, his partner, was caught and sent to jail. But the bank went bust. A lot of people lost their money. I know my friend Jeanette Russell, she died in the early 2000s or late 90s. Her grandfather, Jim Sartell, he lost all of his savings at that time in the 1880s.
Is that the brick building right over here?
Which one is that?
The one in the center here? The brick building?
That was, yes, where we had the ambulance for a while. That was the original building for the Lancaster National Bank. By the later 1870s or 80s, it moved to Clinton when they put their big boy pants on and became a national bank. And that's where they were when it got robbed. But it went bust after that. So many people lost their life savings. It was not a pretty day in town for many.
So the robbery wasn't here?
No, it would have been over there. It would have been over there. In Clinton, yeah. But the bank began here, and it was still called the Lancaster National Bank. Thank you, yeah.
And he was related to there used to be a program on public TV called the McNeil-Lehrer.
Oh, yeah, the McNeil,
It's
yeah.
the same
Same
McNeil.
family, yeah,
Same
yeah,
family.
yeah.
Yeah, McNeil.
So all kinds of stories we could tell you. And another time I'll tell you about the German immigrant who stayed with the Simons over here. You know the house on the corner of Neck Road with the nice iron gate around it right in the corner? Well, the Simons lived there, and he was a clerk at the bank. And they took in a young German fellow, and he robbed them. He slit their throats in the middle of the night, left them for dead.
In that house?
In that house.
Oh.
And they didn't die. They came very near to it. I mean, they were bleeding heavily, but he didn't hit their jugulars. And it was late at night. Somebody had gone into Worcester for selling stuff at the market, and they were coming through in the wee hours of the morning with their wagon and their horse or their ox or whatever they were driving. And they heard the whimpering whining of these people in the house, and they went in and got Dr. Carter immediately, the local doctor, and he sewed them up. And we have photographs of them, but the photographs have their neckline up high with the clothing. But they survived it. Anyways, all kinds of stories in Lancaster. That was the 1860s, was it? I think. I don't have my notes for that right now, but yes.
They lived on and they're
It's
buried
just
in a little cemetery.
Yep. All right, we're off track. I'm sorry. It's easy to stray. Much like Herbert, I can stray too. So another brother was John Green Chandler. He was born in 1815, again in Petersham, before the family had settled here in the 1820s. And as a young boy, though, he came here in his youth, and he worked for the only publishing firm we ever had in Lancaster up to that point, Carter and Andrews, which started in the 1820s and ran up until about the mid to late 1830s. And as was mentioned in the storybook that we heard, one of the buildings that Herbert had in his backyard, besides the carriage house that was moved, was one of the buildings here from the Carter-Andrews operation. It had been just a few houses over in the back of Dr. Bartlett and Mrs. Bartlett's home. It had originally probably been up to the center, and it somehow got moved down there at some point. Again, I don't know how they moved all these buildings around, but they did. And so a very interesting aside, the last people who lived in that house were my grandmother, my mother, and my uncle. The Bartletts rented it out. And in 1966, they donated it to Herb Hosmer. They were supporters of what he was doing, and they wanted a tax write-up. He had a nonprofit. So they donated the building to him around 65, 66. So my grandmother had to move out. My mother got married that same year. My uncle got married as well. And my grandmother moved down the road to Mrs. Miles' house on Centerbridge Road, around the corner. But anyways, the house got moved down there in 1966. Herbert had his friend Herbert Gorey design a nice foundation to make it another story higher. And that became the John Green Chandler Memorial Museum building. And John Green Chandler here had worked in that building as a youth when he learned the trade of printing and especially steel engraving and lithograph with stone lithography. In fact, he was one of the leading pioneers in the Boston area for lithography. Now, we take these things for granted today, but wind back with me 225 years ago. Paper was scarce. I mean, it wasn't so scarce nobody saw it, but you didn't walk in the store and buy a 500-page ream of paper for $20. No, paper was pretty hard to come by back then. A lot of it was handmade, and it wasn't until the Industrial Revolution came along and the textile boom, somebody decided to realize, gee, we can do this with paper too, and they could mass-produce paper. So the cost of paper came down, publication became more profuse, and then the next stages were developed in the printing industry. Lithography saw a huge jump difference in the printed material. Up until that point, you would be printing usually pressed with a printing press, either by hand or as we started getting some of the steam presses and the early automated ones, you could speed up the production. But it was still basically the same technique. You'd roll some ink on an engraving or raised ink press, and press it into the paper, and it was black and white. It was whatever ink color you had and white paper. And then you'd have to come through it and hand color it. If you wanted to have a colored book, you got to hand color it with watercolors or pencils or chalk or whatever medium you're going to use. Well, lithography came along, and there was a whole new explosion of creativity. You could print very succinctly beautiful, bright colors and mass production all of a sudden. So those children's books, especially back then, went from these little black and white rag books that didn't have hardly any color or form to them other than maybe, if you're lucky, some pictures and all black and white text, to an explosion of color and gaiety with bright, vivid colors. This is in poor shape, but it's a cover of McLaughlin Brothers book. It was well used. They liked that one. But you suddenly had this explosion of color and design, and it was cheaper to manufacture these things. So the innovative artists and printers of the day, like John Green Chandler, took advantage of these new designs and these new techniques, and they targeted certain audiences like children. So you had a big jump in children's literature and paper toy products. Now, what are some of the paper toy products that you would think could be interesting? Paper dolls, that was one of them. We have paper dolls like John Green Chandler designed one of the very first American commercial paper dolls in 1854. Here's the box, original box, printed in Boston at Crosby, Nichols and Company. And this was the inside picture of little Fanny Gray's cottage in her neighborhood, the little bridge. And it had interchangeable dolls. And here's one of them that corresponded with a storybook for little Fanny's storybook, her tale. Usually they had a moral lesson. You know, she fell into a calamity after another and a pitfall after another, and at the end of the day she was redeemed and all was well because she was a good little girl. Right. So these storybooks came with it, and there were corresponding outfits to the story, and you would pull the head out, and the little head would fit and tuck into the different outfits for the different stories. So these are all original paper dolls that John Green Chandler had designed and were published down in Boston. Herbert was absolutely enthralled to find all these historical things out about his family. He had some of the original artwork that his uncle had done. He had some of the very early printed and published materials that the uncle had made. He also had made in 1858, now it's with the American Antiquarian Society, I sold it some years ago, but a boxed set that was designed for boys in 1858 called the American National Circus. So they were way ahead of their time in some of their innovativeness back then, and the creativity was just amazing. So he was a very, very prominent pioneer in this area, in this state, and Herbert was strongly inspired by his great-granduncle, John Green Chandler.
Okay, so
yes.
Dolly Green Chandler, were they brother and sister, or was she?
That was his mother.
That's his mother.
That's his mother.
Okay.
So Nathaniel and Dolly Green Chandler were his parents, the ones that were in Petersham and inherited Captain Samuel Ward House. And some of the names are similar, like you have Mary Green Chandler, right. John Green Chandler. They were brother and sister, but they had the same middle name. I guess they liked their family names quite a bit. But he was very well known. He married a woman named Sarah, is it Guild? I think. Yeah, am I getting that right? Yeah. I think that's it. And they had two daughters. Fanny and Alice. Alice Green Chandler was a very prominent person in Lancaster for many years. She moved here into their house. He built a house when he retired from Roxbury, Boston. He came to Lancaster. It's still standing up on Main Street across from the Perkins School. And he died there in 1879. But his daughter, Alice Green Chandler, who never married, lived there until she died in 1934. She was the head librarian here, tremendous influence on Herbert's mother. That's why Beth went into library work, because of her cousin, Alice Green Chandler. Her older cousin inspired her for that and encouraged her too. She helped pioneer some of the legislation and the structuring of the state library system that we thrive with today, and we take so much for granted. She was one of the early promoters of the public library system in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So these people were not just idle watchers; they were movers and shakers. They used to really take a passionate stand for what they believed in and supported. So when he died, the property went to his wife and then the daughter Alice. When she died in 1934, it was Herbert's mother that became the executor of their estate. So Herbert was able to get a lot of these early things because his mother was the executor of the estate, so all the artwork. They had no grandchildren. They just had the two daughters, neither of which had children. Herbert's mother got all of these things. They had the original manuscript for 1840 for the first American edition of Chicken Little. It sold at Skinner's. Laura was there. I was the underbidder. It went for 28,000 or something. I dropped out. I dropped out. A high-end children's book dealer down in Manhattan got it, Justin Schiller, and he since has confided in me that he wouldn't tell me who, of course. He's going to keep his principles and professional name intact, but he said it was bought by a European collector, so it's not even in the country anymore as far as I know. And it was missing page 1, and I'm always and ever on the spy when I find anything from Herbert's to see if I can find that first page floating around somewhere, but so far it's never surfaced. And also with that sale went the original printer's proof blocks, the original illustration plates. So I was hoping to keep it in town, but it's gone somewhere to Europe. Maybe Elizabeth bought it, I don't know. So again, we have the Fanny Gray paper dolls, one of the outfits in the box, very colorful. Again, this is an example of the lithograph technology that had been pretty new at the time. And it was very exciting for people making toys and things for children. Here's the box for the American National Circus I mentioned. And there's some of the cutouts. Now here's the daughter, Alice Green. We talked about her. She looked very mannish, didn't she? She always looked very mannish. Yeah. And now we have another map here again showing the family estate where Mary Green was living, Mary Green Chandler Ware, in 1898 still. She died, I think it was 1904 or 1907. She left it to her niece and her nieces, Caroline. Remember I mentioned Caroline, Herbert's grandmother. She had the two sisters that never married, and they were living there with their aunt. They were taking care of her, and it was left to Elizabeth, Marion and Elizabeth. And Elizabeth Chandler, who they called Bessie, Aunt Bessie, when she died in the late 30s, she left it to her namesake, Elizabeth Avery Hosmer, Herbert's mother. So Herbert was in the G.F. Chandler house here, which was where Edmund Sears had built, and the greenhouses were behind. Right now, this is where the AUC Haskell Hall is, right here. And this is Flag Street here, and the Bartlett Art Gallery or Bird Museum would be here. So this is where Herbert was born, and they had some stables here. There wasn't a residence, but they had those horse stables for Eugene Van Rensselaer Thayer, who had the White House over here, which was called Fairlawn by the Thayers. And so Elizabeth, who was living here, inherited the Aunt Beth's house, and so the family moved around 1940, 39 over there. Now we have a picture. We know they were still living in 1938 here because we have a photo postcard of Herbert and his father, Herbert Sr., standing behind their house, surveying the damage of a huge tree that blew over into the house during the hurricane of 38. And they were just looking at like, what are we going to do? And so what they ended up doing was moving over to the conveniently recently inherited big house. And so Herbert, who already had a keen interest in such things, hit the jackpot. That place had been in the family since the early 1700s. And it was chock full of family material, antiques, furniture, exquisite things. The family traveled abroad, trips to Europe, trips around New England and in the States, family photographs. Oh, he was like a kid in a candy store. But he was not a little boy like the book would have us, the storybook. He was in his 20s when they inherited this. His mother inherited it. So they moved over there. Now here's a picture of George Frederick Chandler with his two grandchildren, Winthrop and Elizabeth Avery. So Elizabeth Avery was the mother of Herbert Hosmer. So there she is sitting on her grandfather's lap. And we presume that was taken in the old Sears Chandler house. So that's from about 1890. And here's the house itself. This is where Herbert was born in 1913, the Edmund Hamilton Sears house. Now, when the college purchased this land, they wanted to expand in the 1930s, and they wanted a new administration building, which we called Haskell Hall. They started the project in 1939. They dug a large hole. They were all ready to, perched and poised to build this beautiful new place. And what happened? World War II came along, and suddenly there was a moratorium on materials, war effort. So there's a big hole in the ground there for about 5 years before they could revisit and finish it. During that period, somewhere in the late 30s, early 40s, this building, which has a back L, you can see a little bit of it there, and the front, was taken apart and moved over to George Hill, next to what we call Dairy Road now. It's still there. So it was saved, but it was relocated. And an interesting aside for anybody that knows the local music history, a very well-known musical group, the New England Youth Ensemble, that Virginia Jean Rittenhouse had founded at the village church in her living room, my church, back in the 60s. When she and her family came here, fresh from the mission field of South Africa, for her father to teach history and the mother music at AUC, they lived in this house for their first house here when they came. Here's Edmund Hamilton Sears. He was the minister that had it built, that wrote the Christmas Carol. This is approximately where the building stood now. There's a stone still out front, and that's the new administration building, Haskell Hall. And of course, if you look in the background, you can see the tail end here of Lenham Hall, which was the men's dormitory built in 1956-57 on the site of the Captain Samuel Ward House. So you can see they were neighbors. They were with just the road, George Hill Road, splitting between them. This was Herbert's mother when she was younger. She graduated from Clinton High School, and she married Herbert Henry Hosmer Sr., and here he is, a younger picture of him. He was the grandnephew of another storekeeper in town and postmaster, whose store happened to be just a little next door on Main Street from where Herbert grew up, and that was Henry F. Hosmer. That was Hiram Hosmer's brother, and Hiram was Herbert's grandfather and this gentleman's father. His father died when he was fairly young, and he went to live with Henry, his uncle, and that's how he ended up in Lancaster. And the Hosmer family goes back a long way. I'm related to Herbert. He was my 6th cousin, 3 times removed. And we have mutual descent from James Hosmer in Concord, an early prominent resident of Concord, Mass.
What year was that?
The 1600s. And also the White family, John and Joanna White Blessing, who had another daughter named Mary that married the first minister, James Rawlinson. She was an aunt to Herbert and I, back great. And the Whitcombs, and I think he had some lines to Prescott and Houghton also, if I remember correctly, and Sawyer. Anybody in Lancaster for any length of time, we're all cousins somehow, somewhere. Anyways, this is Herbert's father. He was a clerk, and it was a little funny. He would frequently sit down, he'd be at the Bridge Diner, and he liked the working class people more. He felt more at home with the riffraff, whereas his wife was more refined with the cultured and educated. And he'd be puffing on his cigars down there playing cards with his buddies there, and Herbert and the mother be tooling around doing their, and it was always kind of comical. Everybody got along just fine, but the personality differences were quite vast. People wondered, how did he marry Beth Avery? But he died in 1955, and that was, I think, a large motivation for Herbert's mother and Herbert to sell the old house, because the money had been dwindling. Herbert started teaching, I think, soon after that in the public schools. He had graduated up at high school in a school way up in New Hampshire at the New Hampton School for the Boys. And then he went to the Massachusetts School of Art down in Newton, and he got his college degree there back in the 30s. I have a senior college book, yearbook. I couldn't put my hands on it. It's in one of my many boxes, but I did get that on eBay. And then he came back here helping his parents, dabbling in puppetry in his collection and having a little bookstore. And then eventually he found gainful employment and income, which he very much needed, with the public school system teaching 4th grade in this very building that we're in. I think he began in the late 50s or the early 60s. That's one of the things I haven't found an exact date. I had letters from the 1960s of Frank Mitchell telling him, Herbert, you can't fall asleep during your class. Lunch. He would nod off. When I was a child, I went to Lancaster Public Schools, K through 3, 4th grade at Browning. The one year I went to Browning was the year I was supposed to have Herbert for my homeroom teacher. So I had Herbert for my teacher one afternoon, step-up day of 3rd grade when we went at the end of the school year up, and we came up to this building, and his classroom was on that side, and I can't remember if it was 1st or 2nd story. That I'm fuzzy on. I was like 4th grade. I was like, what, 10? He was great. I loved him. But then I went down to Browning, so I never had him for a teacher. But I was already a little friendly with him because I used to have my birthday parties at the Toy Cupboard Theater. And let me tell you, those were enchanting times. He would always have the same kind of a deal. You could pick which theme you wanted, multiple storylines, the Billy Goat's Gruff and some of the ones that Paul mentioned. There was a few that weren't what you would call politically correct. Little Sambo Goes to the Bazaar. But you could pick which one you wanted, pay a little fee, it was very modest, and have all your friends there for a puppet show and your birthday party with a cake, cupcakes, punch, and you had a very fancy Gothic chair that was the throne, and you get to have your little crown on, you were the king of the party or the queen of the party. That I think sold at McPhail's, and I missed getting that one. I was limited in what I could get. Yeah, there's pictures. Yeah, we have pictures that are in the album, yes. Those were such fun times. And this little bell, this would summon the boys and girls to attention. And some of the more rascally students or patrons, like my friend Jeff Batchelder, after a couple of shows realized, well, gee, that bell sounds like any bell, and brought his bell from home with him. So we were all floating around in the Toy Cupboard Theater looking at the stuff, waiting for the show to start, and Jeff would ring the little bell, and we'd all fly to the benches looking for nothing. Yeah, that was cute. Then we started, Herbert came out and confiscated that bell. But this was the original silver bell that he used to start the show. And he would just project the personality of those characters so well. He had what I call a Lancastrian version of the Boston Brahmin accent. He had a very distinguished New England accent, and he went the full range. Way up high with a little shrill, way down low, and he would go all over the charts, and it was always the same voice. It was him, but it was different levels and pitches, and he would just move those marionettes around like they'd come to life, and he could tell his story so well, and he would roll with it. If there was a mistake, like was mentioned, well, he's doing his handstand. He always wanted to be in the circus. He would just roll with whatever happened, and we had a ball. We loved it. And then afterwards, of course, the cupcakes and the little present for the birthday person. And we get to go through the John Chandler Museum. Always a thrill. He loved entertaining people. He had a real knack and a real charm for it. He was always a quintessential boy at heart. He never grew up. And he was the Peter Pan, yes. And for all of his expertise and just astounding research and memory to the most minute detail about books and publishing firms and artists and genre of children memorabilia, he was equally awful with business, bookkeeping, and business management. Poor Herb. But we still loved him, and he made that theater and museum go for over 55 years. It was the longest going puppet theater in the United States when he died Thanksgiving Day in 1995. Okay, I don't want to bore you too long here. We're hurrying. So here's his mother in her older age. She, as I mentioned, was influenced by Alice, her cousin. She became the assistant librarian here at the Lancaster Library in Altair. And back in those days, traveling wasn't quite as easy. Even though we had the trolley up until the 20s running up and down Main Street, when Herbert was born, you could ride the trolley from Fitchburg all the way to Worcester and beyond. Went right past near his house, not quite by him, but right down the road to join Main Street again. So it wasn't as easy to get around, Not everybody had a car, especially during the Depression or the earlier days. So they had a South Lancaster branch of the public library. And it happened to be in a building right next to the Thayer Bird Museum, which was right next to where Herbert grew up. So it was right next door there. They started around late 1890s, early 1900s. It ran all the way up until the 30s when the college bought it. That building was the original Henry F. Hosmer store, and it was moved over to Dairy Road. It's still standing. It's the earliest standing building we have of a South Lancaster Post Office General Store. Back then they were together, privately owned. And so Beth was the librarian, the head librarian at the branch, South Lancaster branch. And when my grandmother, who died 2 years ago, she was 97, when she was a little girl, she would go to that library to get books, and she remembered Mrs. Hosmer and said you had to be on your best behavior, but she was very helpful and very kind to the children and very, very good. Yeah. All right, we hit the wrong button. There she is in her older age, dressed up, I think, probably for the 1953 festivities.
That's with the Current Topics.
Or the Current Topics Club, yes, which she was a member, as had been her Aunt Mary and others. Here's the old Hosmer store that I just mentioned, which later became the back section, the branch office of the South Lancaster Post Office, South Lancaster Library, Public Library. It was eventually purchased by, I think, John Thayer, and one of his workers, the Ansel, Mr. Ansel, lived there with his family, and he was the chauffeur and assistant, and it became known as the Ansel House, and that's over by the corner of Dairy Road and George Hill still.
That's a terrible shape.
Yes.
It's horrible.
Can you back up one?
Oh, sure.
Thank you. The Henry F. Hosmer is Herbie's uncle?
His granduncle.
Granduncle.
Henry F. Hosmer's brother, Hiram Hosmer, was the grandfather of Herbie Hosmer Jr. So this was his granduncle. And one time there was something going on at AUC, and I needed a costume for something we were doing old back in the 80s. And I asked Herbert, I said, do you have anything old for a costume? He lent me Henry F. Hosmer's top hat. Oh. And the man had a bigger head than me. I had to tuck some cloth around the end, but I had it for a day. I was petrified something would happen to it. Then I brought it back to Herb. But Herb was always kind that way. Here's little Herbie as a boy in his cart. And this is probably behind, it looks like the aunt's house, maybe the back side of the Captain Samuel Ward house possibly, I don't know. Maybe, okay, that's the Thayer stable then. Okay, so it's right in the side of the George Frederick Chandler place. And here's little Herbie with his hat and his little cart, and he's got, it looks like a sailboat or something on his lap. And
Still had both.
could be, yeah, he still had some hair under that hat, I guess. Now we got a picture up the road. I mentioned the trolley. You see the trolley re-entering Main Street. His aunt, Mary Green Chandler, did not want the trolley going past the house, but the cousin Alice was even more adamant about not wanting the trolley going by her house. When they were designing the preliminaries for the trolley route in the 1890s, oh, she lobbied long and hard, tried to come up with all these concoctions to make it look cumbersome so they wouldn't do it.
Weren't the Thayers?
But the Thayers, well, she was up on Main Street across from Perkins School now, and she had it going down Langan Road, another one going further up around by Harvard Road and down, anything but trying to make it as cumbersome as possible. And at the end of the day, though, Nathaniel Thayer didn't want it going by his mansion either, but she was nowhere near as wealthy or influential as their friends, the Thayers up the road, and they were all friends. They were all quite socially connected. So instead of going Langan Road or whatever, they compromised it out. Much to Alice's chagrin, it still went by her house. But it exited Main Street just up here on Centerbridge Road. And it went down Centerbridge Road a little ways, and there was another bridge that paralleled the railroad bridge, which was still there. And it went across that, and it followed behind where Bigelow Gardens is now. You can still see the evidence of the bed up there. And then it came down back onto Bolton Road, right next to the railroad track. If you go under the bridge heading east on Bolton Road, and you look carefully, it's gotten a little more disheveled, but you can see there's a little bit of a slope going up the hill there. That's where the trolley descended back down and came onto Bolton Road and rejoined right here onto Main Street. This is where the fire department is, and this is now called the Samuel Ward Park. and there's an old granite watering trough in the corner. But that's where the trolley re-entered Main Street. So poor Alice Green Chandler had to hear the trolley and the rebel rousers ring and ding by her house, but not Nathaniel Thayer. Here's the town green. Herbert taught in this school to the right, the center school, also known as the Lancaster High School, which we're currently in, called Prescott Building today. It was built in 1904, and then the library the family was very well connected, and the church they attended was the Unitarian Church, which of course Pastor Thayer had officiated over back when Captain Samuel Ward was here. And they used to be very good friends. They were neighbors, and they would call them church and state, because Captain Ward was very involved in the state and community affairs, and the minister, of course, was involved in the theological and ecumenical and church affairs. So they'd call them Old Church and State. Here's the Unitarian Church too here, built again the year without a summer, that back in 1816. All, by the way, of local material. The bricks for this building were from the Burbank Brickyard up in northern Lancaster. The timber was hewn from local lumber and trees, and even the slate on the roof came from the Lancaster Slate, which quarry, which was up where Devens is now. Fort Devens is a big hole in the ground full of water. Some of the best slate in New England was mined there in the early 1700s. The State House on Beacon Hill, the original State House, was slated with Lancaster slate. And here's the library before the current additions were added on, although the 1897 stacks are visible. 1927, the children's wing was made, and then in the 90s, early, we built the new south wing and redid the back stacks to a much larger and elevator. Yep. Here's the thing. There's the Prescott House. There's little Herbie again with one of his dolls. And his cat. He always loved the cats. Always had a cat. Here he is in his youthful days with one of his cousins, I believe. Look at this is quite the outfit. It's supposed to have been I'd say this was late 20s or early 30s. And here's the photo I said of the hurricane of 38. So we have Herbert Sr. here and Herbert Jr. there, and they're both looking like, oh my, what are we going to do now? And that was the backside of the Sears Chandler house. Here's the house as it is today on George Hill Road. So this is the original section in the front, and this was the back L. And this is the Henry F. Hosmer store, and that's along George Hill, and that's where they are still today. And that's the front of the main section of the Sears Chandler Hosmer house. Here's the Aunt Bessie that I mentioned. She died in 1939, and she left the Captain Samuel Ward house to Herbert's mother. Here's the three sisters. Marion's sitting in the middle with a Bible or a book in her hand. Caroline, Herbert's grandmother, is standing with a nice doll in her arms. And Aunt Bessie is to the right, standing with a little dreamy look on her face. Herbert took that original photograph and he paid a professional paper doll designer to make a set of paper dolls fashioned after the aunts and the grandmother as they appeared in that photograph. I had that set, and I had to sell it when I had trouble some years ago, and it's in the hands of a private serious collector now. I keep thinking I should contact them, see if they want to sell it back to me now. This is the Captain Ward house again, but we have a real good shot of what later was detached and moved as the Toy Cupboard Theater.
Let's fast forward to what the campus is now. What happened?
All right, here's the toy cupboard. We had mentioned this was the cupboard that was in the old shed that Herbert had painted. He did not paint this himself. One of his classmates from the Massachusetts School of Art, who was staying with him part of the time of her summer, she painted those figurines. He gave her guidance, but she painted those, kind of a Peter Hunt style. Here's some literature from the puppet shows, some of the puppets, and one of the early shows with the Toy Cupboard Theater before it was moved. This is from, I think, 1941. And again, pictures from that first thing. This is Helen Rowell Grout. She lived in South Lancaster. Herbert never drove. He never got his driver's license. Always dependent upon others to transport him. She would drive him a lot around because he had what was called the traveling troops. He would have a puppet show that would, he could have a little makeshift theater hutch and the puppets, and he would go to schools and parties and public places, libraries. She often was the one that drove him. And here she is collecting the money from the Boys and Girls for one of the shows around 1950. And this is in the Lancaster Library when he would do an annual show in the library. And here's where they detached the building to move it across the street when they were tearing things down in 1957. A lot of work went into moving that poor old building. That's what ended up getting built there.
1957.
Yeah, and then they later in the 70s with the oil and energy crunch, they re-sided it because they were losing so much heat out there, and it's got a brown exterior now. That's how it looks today. And that's another one. So this is the new house, which he later called the Rackety Packety House. Again, some of the material came from the Captain Samuel Ward house. The front door, by the way, came from the Parsons house on Beacon Hill, as did also the bell, the ringing bell that he had there. And there's the house, as most of us remember it. Here he is walking some boys and girls to the relocated toy cupboard theater. We had those doors. Heather has them in her basement. I was able to save those. But the building was far too rotted. We were hoping to move it. It was just too far deteriorated. 200 some odd years old. Yeah, they took down, the new owners sold that. Not much left but fragments in the house. He would design the puppets, but he would sometimes carve the faces, but he usually relied upon friends and family to do the costumes, the sewing part for him. Here again are the boys and girls in the Lancaster Library for a puppet show. And here's his mother and the former minister of the Unitarian Church in the parlor at the Unitarian Church. And Herbert collected a lot of juvenile things, including rewards of merit cards, which were very popular in the 19th century and even into the early 20th century. Beautiful, colorful little mementos of jobs well done for the boys and girls to receive from a teacher or a parent or a grandparent. Here we are watching the John Green Chandler house getting moved in 1966. Amazing how they moved these things around. There we are setting it up next to the theater in the new house.
It's in New York somewhere.
Pieces, it was in pieces, yeah.
Somebody bought it.
Yeah, and they took what they could of the,
The story
yeah,
was they're going to resettle it in New York
yeah.
somewhere.
And there's the building after the foundation was made underneath it by Herbert Gorey. So he actually gained another story for more space, made it a 3-story. Herbert had quite a collection. He had one of the most coveted collection of animated material, paper dolls, dollhouses, children's toys, juvenile books, and portraits. Here's some of his prized possessions for the opening day of the John Green Chandler Memorial Museum in the early 70s. I think it was around 71 they opened it. And here's some of the paper theaters. He had a big collection of paper theaters. One of the visitors, the patrons looking at it. Some of the puppet shows, more puppet shows. And he had a smaller style puppet set. Paul LaCour had the bigger ones later, but Herbert had the smaller sized ones when he had done it. That little rascal in the blue coat might look familiar to you. He was enjoying his birthday party that day in 1971 with his cousins at the John Green Chandler Museum. Look at the plaid pants, plaid bell-bottom pants.
So John, will you come back and do part 2 here? We're getting long.
We're just about at the end, actually. We're right about the end, Heather. So here's the puppet theater again inside the John Green Chandler Museum, one of the traveling troops theaters. And Herbert here for the bicentennial, or no, like 1970, I guess, the new sign. He was very active. Herbert here he is handing out awards, the John Green Chandler Awards. He knew a lot of famous artists. He was personal friends with Maurice Sendak of the Wild Things. They were actually dating for a while. I remember Herbert liked the gentlemen, not the ladies. And they had many a Thanksgiving dinner together down in Connecticut. And in one of his books, The Midnight Kitchen, I think it was, in The Night Kitchen, thank you, Laura, he featured, if you look at the artwork on the pages, Herbert's mentioned and also Chicken Little on some of the food containers in South Lancaster in the artwork in the children's book. Here's the famous Parson Chandler house. Here's Herbert with Paul LaCour, the man who narrated and did the storybook we just watched. And here's a beautiful shot with Herbert, one of his colorful shirts and his marionettes by the sign. So these are a recap of some of what I already told you, but all the different connections of the family members in town. Very, very active. He was actually the first chairman of the Lancaster Historical Commission. And he told me himself when it was formed in the 1960s, the Mass General Legislature made a new law which made provision for the towns to have such. He was very careful to choose people from each of the churches in town. And so there was the Unitarian Church, Congregational Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and the Adventist Church person he chose was Rochelle Kilgore, and she had been a correspondent to the Item and interested in historical things. So he was very broad-minded, good Unitarian, and he wanted to make sure all the different groups were represented in the original Historical Commission. And he also became a member in 1985 of the American Antiquarian Society. I could tell you a great story about the McLaughlin collection, but you can look that up online, and Laura, who's with us today, will tell you all about it on a YouTube feed or the American Antiquarian Society page. But he rescued a lot of these items from a descendant, a daughter of one of the executives of the McLaughlin brothers, moved up to Milton Bradley in the 30s because they bought it out in Springfield, Mass. It's an exquisite collection, and now it's at the American Antiquarian Society, thanks to Herbert. Yes. That's in Worcester on Salisbury Street. It's the oldest private library of its kind in America. It has the largest collection of printed and published material. It was founded by Isaiah Thomas, who wrote The Massachusetts Spy, a patriot publisher during the American Revolution. And it was also co-founded by other prominent people. And Thomas Jefferson was an early member. It's a very distinguished organization. Laura works there. We're very happy to have Laura here. This is Herbert Stone. I got to tell you one fast, quick story. When I used to visit Herb in college, I'd go over there sometimes between classes and visit with him. By that time, he had become, more frail. His health had been declining. He was pretty much confined to what I called the piss pot chamber room. He had a chamber pot, so it smelled pretty heavy of urine in that room. But he had the front downstairs room converted into a makeshift bedroom. And he was often in bed or sitting up in the chair with a blanket around him. And I would knock on the door, randomly between classes sometimes, and never knowing if he was up for a visit or not. And he'd say, yes, who is it? He opened the door, and I'd call her, and it's me, Herb. It's John Schumacher. Hardy. He said, and he'd tell me to come in or that to come back, depending what he was doing. But most often, he would invite me in because he wasn't doing too much. And I'd go in, and I'd apologize. I said, Herb, I'm so sorry to come in without an appointment, but I'm in between class. He says, nonsense, nonsense. We're friends. He says, you come anytime. Nonsense. He says, we need to learn to get along now. We're going to spend a lot of time together. We're going to be neighbors. And he'd say that all the time when I apologized. And I'm thinking to myself, what is he talking about? I was in my 20s in college, my late teens, early 20s. So finally one day I mustered enough courage to ask him. I couldn't figure it out. And I said to him, Herbert, what are you talking about? We're going to be neighbors. He says, well, you're a shoemaker, aren't you? I said, yes. He said, well, I'm a Hosmer and related to the Averys. He says, my people are buried in Eastern Cemetery. I'm going there someday, and I expect you're going to be my neighbor. And sure enough, he's buried in front of my great-grandparents' grave, Shoemaker, and I just bought the 12 lots over here, so we're going to be neighbors. Herb had a good sense of humor. So I usually put a pink geranium on his. Every year I'm putting my family flowers out, I remember Herb too. He was amazing Lancasterian, and he was a child at heart that we all enjoyed seeing the puppet shows in his collection. Thank you for your time.